You are now tuned in to the Storm Tracker podcast.
Welcome back to the Storm Tracker podcast. I'm Marcus Benjamin, representing for CanesCounty.com, part of the Rivals.com network. Make sure you follow this podcast on all platforms and also subscribe to this YouTube channel live from Canes County. It's our weekly scheduled program, Scouting the Opponent, and I have Jacey Zembal joining me from NC State Rivals. Thank you for joining me today, Jacey.
Thank you.
And Miami, of course, is going to travel to Raleigh this week to take on the Wolfpack. Should be a fun game, another primetime game, Miami. I can't think of another year where it's been this many primetime games for the Hurricanes. But should be a good one for sure. The coach of NC State, Dave Dorean himself, he made some headlines this week with after their win over Clemson, 24-17 was the final score. He said to Steve Smith, who was actually on game day earlier that day, Steve Smith actually said that NC State is a basketball school. And Dorean said, basically to kiss his ass after the win, which was funny to hear. Just what can you tell me about his personality? And is that something that you're surprised to hear at all?
Yes and no. So, basically Smith it wasn't so much calling NC State a basketball school, that their fans were looking to basketball season. And, whatever it was about it that got into Dave's craw. And obviously, say it was said before noon, he can't wait to say it, 5 o'clock, 5:30, whatever time it was when the game ended, it was still in his head at 5:30 p.m., all those hours later. So sometimes some people in the media have referred to him in those kind of moments as Salty Dave. And usually Salty Dave comes out when they play Clemson for some reason, like more often than other opponents. Whether they win or they lose, there's a little saltiness after playing Clemson. Now, the great irony about the NC State-Clemson rivalry is that, assuming Clemson can't get out of the grant of rights over the next X amount of years, is that the ACC is like, yeah, we don't want NC State and Clemson to play each other all that often anymore because of SMU, California, and Stanford. So that was kind of like one of the big news from last night. So a very underrated. I consider it a rivalry. People might say, well, Clemson has won most of the games, but there's something about that game that either it's a huge win whenever NC State has done it in the past. There's always a little bit of friction between the two schools on the recruiting trail because historically, Clemson will try to come into North Carolina and get 5-6 players each recruiting class, obviously players that NC State wants. So then sometimes it becomes very big recruitments, which is what happened with Dexter Lawrence and guys like Will Shipley. And then, you just kind of find out where you are, in terms if you're going to win the ACC. Historically, it's been the last, say, 10 years, you have to go through Clemson. Before that, when it was Florida State and when Chuck Amato was the coach at NC State, Florida State was that type of litmus test. And, it was a huge deal when NC State beat Florida State. So that was kind of like all the background there. It went bigger than I thought it would. I don't know if that's just the credit to the fame of Steve Smith, even 7 years after he last played a game. But between Dave Doran's fame and Steve Smith's fame, it really combined to be something. I don't even have a lot of followers, because I'm essentially restarting a site. But it went over 300. It's closing in on 300,000 views on Twitter and closing in on 100,000 views on Instagram. That's just me. So
Yeah.
you add all the views together from everybody. Obviously Dave Dorean got seen and heard from a lot of eyeballs that maybe didn't know who Dave Dorean was. But to get back to your original question, a little bit of kind of like his personality, he's more reserved. There's always been an edge to him, and the edge usually comes out if they lose, or if he doesn't like something. But he's very consistent. He usually knows exactly what he wants to say before he says it. You kind of know what you're going to get at each press conference, each media availability. In a lot of ways, he's very much like the person he replaced, which was Tom O'Brien, who was pretty much the same type of way. Where if Tom was going to do something that he thought was viral, it was probably something well thought out, days before. In Tom's case, he went after UNC when they were going through the academic scandal and basically called it the triple play of doing things that were wrong. And that was his viral moment. And I'm sure he thought about that well before he said it. So
Sure.
that I think you have two kind of coaches. You got some coaches that fly off the cuff or maybe do what Devil Sweetie did last night on his radio show where I'm sure he didn't plan to go off on a radio caller, but it just kind of happened. And then you have coaches who pretty much generally know what they're going to say before they say it. And I would say, over 11 years, Dave Dorean is pretty good at conveying what message he wants out.
Yeah, I actually just saw that headline with Dabo this morning, and I was like, okay, wow, things are troubling over there in South Carolina. But on to this game, NC State made a change at quarterback. They decided to go with Brennan Armstrong, who was at UVA. I mean, that's a quarterback that Miami is familiar with. Last year, went through 4 overtimes against last season, and he reunites with his offensive coordinator here. There in Raleigh. So, what have you seen from Brennan Armstrong at quarterback, and do you think this marriage with the offensive coordinator is working?
Well, it looked like it was going to be this dynamic where it was going to work. And there was a lot of excitement going into the season, or at least buzz. And after, I think it was 7 games, specifically the Louisville game, which was the 7th game, the NC State offense just couldn't do anything. Like it was just one of those games. And Louisville's got a nice defense, but it was just one of those games where nothing worked. They couldn't run the ball, they couldn't pass the ball. There was no spark. The crazy thing about that game is Louisville needed like a 53-yard field goal or something to win it. So State was right there despite it not really having any semblance of an offense. And then Monday's press conference comes along and Dave Dorean dropped the bombshell like 4 or 5 minutes in, and he kind of waited a bit. Then all of a sudden he's like, well, MJ Morris is going to be the starting quarterback. And it's like, oh, okay. So now you have this situation where MJ Morris, who was going to redshirt, and then with the dream of being a 3-year starter, that was, the plan. Now all of a sudden he's thrown back in middle of the season, and there was a lot of hope and excitement about MJ Morris. And he did okay in some ways his first game, but he also was throwing some errant interceptions. He was trying to shake off rust. And now I don't know if we've truly seen the true MJ Morris, but it's like this combination where State's very conservative on offense. They're not going to do anything like super crazy. They're not going to air it out, 50 times in a game likely. So because of that conservativeness, it's one of those deals where it's like, okay, MJ Morris isn't really making much of an impact himself either, but at least he's a sophomore. He'll get better, and they can figure out if he's the guy for the future. and you got a couple dynamics at play where A, they could go into the transfer portal and get a quarterback down the road. B, if they can get him to sign-in day, there's a player in South Florida that some of your readers might know about, or people watching the pod, named Cedric Bailey, that's on his way from Chaminade Madonna. And, what someone's going to have to be the quarterback, whether it's a Bailey or Morris or somebody in the portal. But at the moment, the offense is doing just enough to get by. And usually that just enough involves freshman wide receiver Kevin Concepcion.
So you got Morris, I guess, at quarterback now. I was unaware. I'm not really following NC State that closely. So, when did they make that change?
But right after the Louisville game, they threw MJ in there, and they had a high scoring total against Marshall. Now since that game, Marshall has not done very well, but State's trying to do things. I wouldn't say smoke and mirrors, but pop passes to Concepcion, lining him up in the backfield, and giving him the ball. The running game hasn't truly got on track. Now Brennan Armstrong actually came in sometimes for Wildcat quarterback situations. Sometimes he was a running back or / fullback, H-back, whatever you want to call him. And that, in a way, that could be a smart way of using him moving forward. But they're just trying to piece something together. And it's funny, the joke, the half joke last week when I was talking to Larry Williams of Clemson Rivals is whichever team could get to 24 points wins. And that kind of has that vibe for State, where I don't expect them to get to 35 or 20, 28 could be hard. But if they could get to 24 with their good defense, they have shots at winning games. So if State doesn't make mistakes, doesn't have silly penalties, forces a turnover or two, has a good kick return, that's how they piece it together. So like last week, Peyton Wilson gets a pick six. The senior outside linebacker is one of the best in the country. So that 6 points, that play was essentially the difference. I mean, 7-point game against Clemson. It's interesting how, Miami, is coming off of squeaking by Virginia. Now, Virginia had Calandria at quarterback when State played him, the true freshman, because Musket was hurt. And I did watch the Miami-Virginia game. Virginia's much improved, even from the time they played State. But, State squeaked by Virginia, and then, State did just enough against Clemson. And obviously Miami kind of has a similar history with those two opponents. But I don't know I don't know how much NC State's going to be able to score offensively against Miami. So that's why in my head, if they can get to 24 or maybe even 21, and then play stingy defense, like that's their formula. Like they're not going to out pretty a team. They're going to try to grind it out and muck it up and try to win those 24-17, 21-17 kind of games.
Gotcha. And Morris, is he more of a dual threat quarterback? You mentioned that Armstrong, it comes in as maybe a dual threat option, I guess you could say, coming in at H-back in different positions. Is Morris more of a dual threat, or is he more of a in the pocket pro type passer?
Yeah, I'd say Morris is more in the pocket. I think he could take off if need to. It's one of those deals where he played 2.5 games last year and then hurt his knee. And I don't know if there's just a theory of let's not run him too much because let's not risk any kind of future injury. He's not the biggest quarterback around. Like, he's got good height, but I mean, he's not a bruiser at quarterback like Armstrong was. Like, Armstrong looked like, a quarterback who could be a linebacker. Where Morris, he runs when he needs to, and he can. But I think he would prefer, and they would prefer, he stays in the pocket for the most part, and not get hit too many times. I think some quarterbacks, I call it a pitch count on how many hits they get. You're going against fate if your quarterback gets hit, say 7-8 times compared to like 3 times. And sometimes it's unavoidable where you're in the pocket and you let go of the ball and they crush you. And that's kind of the hits that MJ has been taking, more pocket hits when he lets go of the ball. He hasn't been like completely crushed, like maybe once or twice when he takes off and runs. He's more judicious about it, and maybe he gets out of bounds or he slides, but he's not trying to run over people.
Gotcha. Now you mentioned NC State likes to muck it up, and last year the defense was clearly the strength of this team, and it seems like that is pretty much the same deal this season. What can you tell me about this defense, and how have they kind of come up big in games this season for the Pack?
I think the big thing about State's defense in general is they try to keep teams in front of them and then make tackles. They don't miss too many tackles. The real only frustrating thing about the defense this year is they've given up some really big running plays, which they didn't do last year. Last year was like really fluky, where between all the games, like they probably only gave up like maybe 4 or 5 quote unquote big plays. Like it wasn't many, and 4 or 5 might even be too many. It might have been like 2 or 3. I mean, it just felt like it was one of those years where teams didn't get the cheap 60-yard touchdown. I remember Virginia Tech getting a big play and in their passing game, and I think the receiver might have transferred to Notre Dame. But what's happened this year is, UConn running back Victor Rosa had a huge run, like 72 yards, and the big bruising back at Notre Dame rumbled for like 80 yards on the first play of the second half, and they've had plays like that, which were more of the unfortunate, defensive breakdowns. But they've been lucky. They haven't had too many of those, but when they do, those have been frustrating. So, in general, besides keeping teams in front of them and just being really good tackling squad, they blitz a lot, and I mean a lot. So, they don't get a lot of sacks from the D line. They get their sacks from blitzers in the secondary or the linebackers.
Gotcha.
Their best pure pass rusher is a junior college transfer named Jacavis Hibbler. And he'll come in like on obvious passing downs sometimes. He can turn the corner. He's that 6'2", 260-pound dude that just knows how to get around the corner. Davin Van is a good defensive end, should have a chance to play in the NFL. But, yeah, a lot of blitzing from the linebackers or secondary. Don't know where, confuse an offense by doing it from different angles, different spots, different sides of the field. Some twists. I mean, it's one of those deals where they're trying to confuse the quarterback by just making his life miserable. And, for most of that game against Clemson, Cade Klubnik was off. His rhythm was just off. And that's the goal, is to confuse and make it difficult for a quarterback. Every now and then, sometimes they'll do the 3-man rush, and then you have the 8 guys in the zone. And sometimes it drives fans nuts because it takes a quarterback will have all day to figure out what to do. But most often it's interesting, even, because they're throwing against 8 defenders, a lot of times quarterbacks still can't find somebody open despite having all day. So that hasn't really hurt State's defense too much. But the bread and butter is good tackling and a lot of blitzing.
Gotcha. I do want to ask, because there's so much kind of fluctuation in the scores of the season from the Pack. I mean, gave up 41 to Marshall, gave up 45 to Notre Dame, but pretty much kind of shut down Louisville. Only held them to 13 points. Last week you held Clemson to 17. Why do you think there's so much, I guess, fluctuation in the point total from the defense?
I think, the Notre Dame game got away from him in the second half. The tight end for Notre Dame in particular really hurt him. And then, like I mentioned, their running back really got things going with the 80-yard run. Most games have kind of been that situation where maybe 3 plays get away from them. Like, for instance, the Duke game, that was another game. It was 2 offensive plays. That's all Duke had. Of course, the irony is State did the same thing to Clemson last week. They had 2 offensive plays for 120 yards or 122 yards, and then the total yardage was like 205. So it was like one of those deals where basically 2 plays at 120 of the 205. Duke did the same thing. Running back gashed the defense. Something was wrong. Straight up from the alignment, took off for the races. And then Jalen Calhoun did a double move on a backup quarterback and toasted him, 69 yards. That was it. And that's all Duke needed that night. I mean, Duke's defense was just, it goes back to State's offense isn't strong enough yet, and Duke just shut it down. The Marshall game was a little bit of an anomaly. Marshall had 41. Part of it was a pick 6, so really 35. What they did really well is they had a quarterback, Fancher, who could really run. Sometimes he'd run into trouble. Sometimes he'd run himself into sacks, but he could run. And he would put, you never knew what you were going to get each snap because, he's just a little wild. And that could be fun and that could be hurtful to a team, but that's what happens when you're an athletic sophomore. And it'll be interesting to see what Fancher looks like as a senior. So they passed the ball really well against NC State. They had 4 or 5 receivers who, maybe not big names, but they knew how to make some plays. And Fancher, made things happen. And it was one of the rare times. It wasn't even like a deal where you felt like what Marshall did could be replicated. But
yeah.
But NC State was very disappointed with giving up those 35 in the way things went. Now, in many ways, though, they ended up with like a ton of sacks, and they made Fancher earn every single yard he got in the passing game or running game. But I think it was like something like, my memory is like he either ran or threw the ball like 72 times or something, which is like, astonishing number for a quarterback. So that tells you his usage. Not a lot of teams are going to have their quarterback throw or run 70 times. So that was just a different kind of game. But yeah, usually State holds teams into the, it's hard to get to 28 points on State, typically. If you get to 28, you've done some good work. And, you take out the overtime games and whatever, that's all credit to Notre Dame in that second half. They were the better team. But there weren't a lot of times this year where, State couldn't stop someone or slow someone down. And, obviously Duke was playing with their backup quarterback. Clemson is a little bit on the lost side right now offensively. So it's easy to see how they could shut, or slow down some teams like that. Miami is a different animal if Tyler Van Dyke is playing at his upper echelon best. They're going to play UNC down the road. UNC usually always scores. So if they shut down a team like UNC, then that really tells you, how good NC State's defense is. Even Georgia Tech has been scoring pretty good. Not that State plays them, but, it's interesting how there's some teams that can really score in the ACC, and there's some teams in the ACC. It's hard. It's been a real struggle for them to get on the scoreboard this year.
Yeah, for Miami, it's kind of both at times. Sometimes they look great offensively and they're humming, and other times they just look anemic. So it's really kind of a flip of the coin at this point to kind of predict how they'll come out offensively. One more question
I
would
think
be,
Mark Fletcher will make a big difference. If Mark Fletcher plays the way he did last week, I think he'll make a difference against State.
yeah, definitely. The freshman has been looking outstanding as of late, and hopefully AJ Allen could also play as well. He left the game last week with an injury, hamstring injury, so maybe he can go as well. He's more of a, I would say, their home run threat out of the backfield. And wanted to ask about the playmakers on offense. Of course, we kind of know about Concepcion. So what kind of makes him dangerous, and what are some of the other playmakers that Miami should be wary of?
Concepcion, I think, is one of those players, who I got to see sophomore year and junior year, and really, knew what he was bringing to the table before he even committed to NC State. And I just call him a gamer. Maybe the NFL people will say he's not big enough or he's not fast enough. And my response to that is that's fine. It just means they'll end up in college for 4 years. Help NC State really do something for 4 years. But what was always clear about him is that he was fast enough to do what he needed to do, and he's got a certain amount of toughness to him. I always appreciated his versatility, which he's shown at NC State, where now they're giving him the ball in the backfield. They're doing the pop passes or reverse jet sweeps and jet sweeps and things like that. He's not punt returning, but he could do that if called upon. He generally catches most passes that are thrown his way. For the first handful of games, he would catch the 7, 8, 9 yard pass. Nothing crazy. Then in the Marshall game, they used the jet or the pop pass with him. So basically, he was running like a running back. It just, counted it as a pass. So that inflated his numbers in some games. Maybe it wasn't even the Marshall game. It might have been the Virginia game. I don't know. My everything's starting to blur together. But there was like one game basically where he was credited with like 8 catches, but like 4 or 5 of them were just simple pop passes where, he caught a pass that was like 1 foot long, 2 feet in length. So to me, that it's essentially a run. What made him unique in the Clemson game, so he rips off a 50-yard run out of the backfield. They actually took a linebacker and converted him to kind of like a running back, fullback role, let him start for that specific play. And he crushed a dude on a block, and Concepcion's off for the races. So simple play, smartly executed, not so much how great Concepcion was, it's just huge hole, and he ran through it. The second play was impressive in the fact that he's going against Dorean Pride, who I know was touted coming out of East St. Louis, and I want to say he's a sophomore at Clemson on the corner. Clemson sent a huge blitz, just the whole house, and MJ Morris threw a little flare pass, out to KC, and he catches it, and it's literally just him and Pride, nobody else. He makes him miss the tackle, 72 yards, touchdown.
Yeah, I saw that earlier on this.
Tackle, he gains 1 or 2 yards, no touchdown. So it was just that was just he was better than his better than the guy against him. So those 2 plays, like I said, that's 122 yards out of the 205. Which then says who's the other playmakers? Well, if the rest of the offense is getting about 85 yards, that's why they've been struggling. There isn't that consistent second playmaker. Julian Gray has ability, which he's shown on kick returns. Trent Penix, when he was healthy, had one great game as a tight end type, flex tight end. Could play this week, may not, miss the Clemson game. Michael Allen has some speed on the outside as a running back and can catch the ball. But Keon Lasane is the veteran receiver. But that's been the story of NC State this year, is they don't have the second guy. And if KC gets bottled up, then they're really in trouble because they don't have the first guy or anybody to kind of make up for if teams concentrate on Concepcion. So, they can't solve. I don't think you can solve that with 4 games left of the regular season. So, even though it's been obviously a very source of consternation really since the opener against UConn, there's not much you can do. That's problems that get solved in recruiting and the transfer portal. So,
Gotcha.
It is what it is, which goes back to is if they can get to 21, 24 points and make the game ugly, then that's the formula, at least at the moment. Now, if they can come out and score 35 against Miami, then I'm going to guess Hurricane fans are going to really start wondering about their defense. And, it would have to take a lot of great things to happen for State to get into the mid-30s. But that's their identity at the moment.
Well, it sounds like from what you just said that if Miami scores 30 points, then they probably win the game. Miami's failed to reach 30 points in the past couple of games here, but they're able to, win those ugly, muddy type of games in overtime. The last 2 against Clemson and Virginia. The line came out as 4.5. I saw to Miami to win this one. If you had to predict the score, what would it be and why?
I think State's going to have a nice advantage playing at home at night. It's funny. In the Midwest, they love noon games. In the South, they love 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock games. And it's just the contrast. So State fans love to be able to tailgate all day and then go to the game. So that makes them happier than anything. So it will be a full stadium. They'll have close to 60,000 or whatever it seats. It might take a little bit for them to get into the stadium in the first quarter from the tailgate. It might take a little bit for them to get back into the stadium after halftime because they have pass outs at NC State. But they are a factor when they're there. And, I think Miami is probably a 21-17 kind of win type of game. I could see Miami winning 21-17 or maybe even 27-24. That would be my thinking at the moment. I'm not the Miami expert like yourself. I've only seen them against Clemson, and I saw them against Virginia. So I feel like I know what they can do. I get a sense of them. I think State's going to have to do something special to maybe chip or have a second blocker against Ruben Bain. I think that's going to be a big problem. Part of the mucking it up, part of my theory is State's got a heck of a punter and kicker. Like their punter will get it inside the 20-yard line on his punts on the regular, big leg, and then the kicker hit a 57-yarder against Duke, and was a finalist for the kicking award a couple years ago when he was at Western Kentucky. So they have that down. I think clearly Miami has a great kicker too, from what I've seen. So it'll be interesting. It could be a battle of field goals, between the 2 kickers. So that's why I kind of want to have scores. The easy way of thinking would be 24-21, but then I'm like, oh, State would be 3 touchdowns, no field goals. State's going to get some field goals. Miami's going to get some field goals. That's kind of how I see the game. But I just think Miami has a little bit of an edge because I think they have a better offensive identity at this point. They know who they are. If Fletcher gives them the lift that I think they could, if Van Dyke plays way sharper than he did against Virginia, we know what he's capable of doing. There's a great, Miami's got that great possession receiver who just knows how to get open and make plays.
Sure.
I didn't notice much of a tight end this year, which is kind of Miami-like.
Neither have we.
They always seem to have an NFL tight end every year.
Yeah.
But I just think Miami seems to know what they're doing. That maybe the one X factor is, Miami's kind of got that chess piece themselves where they have the really speedy back that ripped it off against Clemson, but he's really a receiver. And they kind of use him the way NC State uses Concepcion. I'll be curious to see how many touches, I guess, because I think what Mario Cristobal's joke was he could never get enough touches. Was his Smith? That's last name?
Brashard Smith, yeah.
Yeah. So I think he could be a real factor because he's got big play speed. So I'll be curious to see how he does. But I don't think Miami is just going to be able to knock NC State off the line of scrimmage and do predictable running play after predictable running play. And it's also hard to throw the flare pass out, the swing passes, because State makes those tackles. So my hunch is that, if Miami wins, they're going to have to really earn it and maybe pop off a big play or two. And that's kind of how I see the game, at least on a Tuesday.
Yeah, I totally agree. When you were talking about Concepcion, I was like, wow, that's the same way that Miami uses Brashard Smith. So I was thinking the same thing there. And I
think Smith's got a little more speed than Kevin, but the State knows that they have to get Kevin the ball 10 to 12 times some way, somehow, whether it's running the ball or catching the ball. If a defense takes him out, I don't know what State would do. Like, I don't know, what their alternatives would be in terms of trying to score points. So, that's kind of where they are. A year from now, I'll be talking about a freshman named Jonathan Paylor, who's a local kid, 45 minutes away. And people would be like, oh, okay, whole offense, totally different. He's that guy. He's just that guy. 5'9", not even a tall guy, 5'9", state champion in track. Kind of like a Ray Joseph in what Ray might be one day. But, where Miami basically lets Ray do the returns, I think NC State is basically going to let Paylor do everything next year. Return game, getting the ball as a running back, getting the ball as a receiver, some of the things that Kevin Concepcion is doing right now. But Paylor will probably get some of those same plays. And then I could, a year from now, I'll be like, okay, the offense is a little more diversified, has different threats, but it's just, it's a grinded out offense at the moment. So, that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I see it very similarly. I think it could be a kicking fest because I think these two teams probably have the two best special teams when it comes to kicking is concerned in the country. Miami's got another punter from Australia, Dylan Joyce, who's been outstanding, and from Andy Borregalis's performances last week, he could be considered a Lou Groza finalist. The way that he's kicking and just the clutch kicks that he's made, and he's been pretty much money with touchbacks as well. So it could be a field goal fest on Saturday night. And yeah, I think it's going to come down to a couple of big plays. I do think Miami finds a way to kind of pull this out. I think it's going to be an ugly game. I think it's going to be very similar to the last two games for Miami, where it may come down to overtime again. We may see a third straight overtime game for Miami, because I do think it's going to be close. I don't think it's going to be a blowout on either side. But I think Miami squeaks one out with an Andy Borregalis field goal. Thanks for joining me today, Jacey. Great stuff from you. Make sure you check Jacey out at NC State Rivals for information on the Wolfpack. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
And that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Storm Tracker podcast, Scouting the Opponent. Make sure you subscribe to our website, canescounty.com. Use the promo code Miami30 for the first 30 days for free. Also, subscribe to this YouTube channel live from Canes County. Until the next episode.